There are moments in history where change does not arrive with explosions or headlines, but instead creeps in quietly through daily behavior, subtle choices, and patterns that only become obvious once it is already too late to reverse them. What we are about to talk about today is one of those moments, and it is something most people are not prepared to face because it challenges the story they have been told for decades. This video is not about shock value or provocation for its own sake. It is about recognizing a shift that is already underway and understanding where it leads if it continues unchecked. If you stay with me until the end, you will see why this conversation matters, not just for men or women individually, but for the future structure of society itself. Before we go any further, make sure you like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this perspective, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all if you want more Angry Guy content and want to get every single video the moment we release it. These discussions are not happening in most places, and the only way they spread is if people actively support them. I also want to remind you to check out Angry's Crypto Academy, which is linked in the description of the video. If you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets, how to grow your wealth responsibly, and how to buy, sell, and trade crypto with a clear framework instead of hype and guesswork, the Academy is there for you. And I strongly encourage you to go check it out now. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support directly, you can do that by buying me a Red Bull using the link in the description. That support helps keep this channel independent and focused on long form discussions that actually say something meaningful instead of chasing trends. Now, let us talk about what is happening, not through slogans or insults, but through observation, behavior, and consequences. There is a growing claim circulating online that women are being locked out of society globally. And at first glance, that sounds exaggerated, emotional, or intentionally provocative. But when you slow down and examine patterns instead of headlines, when you look at how men and women are interacting less, cooperating less, and building separate spaces more than ever before, something uncomfortable begins to emerge. What we are witnessing is not a sudden exclusion enforced by laws or rules, but a gradual withdrawal driven by choices, incentives, and risk avoidance. Men are not staging a formal movement or issuing declarations. They are simply opting out. And the effects of that choice ripple outward into dating, work, entertainment, economics, and culture. The most important thing to understand is that this is not limited to one country or one political system. This is not just a Western phenomenon or an Eastern one. This is a global pattern with local variations, and it is accelerating. In the United States alone, projections show that by the year 2030, nearly half of women between the ages of 25 and 44 will be single and childless. When you include single mothers, that number climbs significantly higher. These numbers are not destiny, but they are signals. They point to a widening gap between how society is structured and how individuals are actually choosing to live. What is often misunderstood is the assumption that these outcomes are driven primarily by women choosing independence or rejecting traditional paths. That explanation is incomplete. A more accurate description is that men are increasingly choosing distance, minimal exposure, and reduced engagement across nearly every domain that once connected the sexes. Dating is only the most visible part of this. Friendship, mentorship, collaboration, and informal support networks are all shrinking. Men are not demanding change through confrontation. They are responding to incentives and consequences by disengaging quietly. To understand how this unfolds, it helps to look at countries where the shift is more advanced. South Korea is often mentioned because of its historically low birth rate and the public debates surrounding gender dynamics. Many people point to movements where women publicly rejected dating or marriage as the primary cause. But what is often left out is the series of responses that followed from men. Policies and workplace dynamics shifted in ways that removed ambiguity and informal negotiation from interactions between men and women. Social rules became stricter, liability increased, and the margin for error disappeared. In response, men adapted by reducing interaction rather than increasing compliance. They did not protest loudly. They simply stopped engaging where risk outweighed reward. In professional environments, accusations of bias or exclusion were met not with reconciliation but with formalized competition. Informal mentorship declined. Cooperation was replaced with strict adherence to rules and performance metrics. In entertainment, content that relied on playful tension or edgy humor was flattened into neutrality, satisfying compliance while losing appeal. Men, already disengaging, moved on to other forms of entertainment that did not require constant self monitoring. What remained increasingly catered to a narrower audience, and participation dropped. This pattern repeats across societies. When systems are designed to remove ambiguity by increasing penalties, people respond by minimizing exposure. That is not ideology, that is human behavior. Men who once acted as informal connectors in social and economic life are choosing solitude, structure, and predictability instead. They are building routines that do not rely on mixed gender cooperation. Over time, this creates parallel ecosystems. Online, this separation is even more visible. Entire networks of male focused media have emerged, not as a unified movement, but as a market response. Content creators who once focused on finance, technology, or entertainment now speak openly about male experiences, risk assessment, and social withdrawal. Gaming spaces, once primarily about products, now discuss cultural shifts and identity. This is not because men suddenly became obsessed with gender debates, but because those debates affect how they choose to participate in shared spaces. At the same time, many men are statistically single while many women believe they are not. This paradox is explained by overlapping relationships, short term arrangements, and the concentration of attention on a shrinking pool of men. That dynamic is unstable. It creates the appearance of connection without long term investment. When those arrangements dissolve, the underlying lack of broad engagement becomes visible. Technology accelerates this process. Automation and artificial intelligence are reshaping labor markets, entertainment, and personal interaction. Men are often early adopters of systems that reduce dependency on social negotiation. Decentralized finance, remote work, trading, and skill based exchange appeal to individuals who prioritize autonomy. These systems do not require traditional social validation. They reward competence, timing, and risk management. Participation is open in theory, but in practice requires a willingness to operate without guaranteed support. Consumption based models struggle in this environment. When fewer men are dating, fewer restaurants thrive. When fewer men attend gyms, traditional fitness centers decline. When nightlife loses male participation, it becomes unsustainable. These are not moral judgments, they are economic outcomes. Men historically subsidized many social industries through spending tied to courtship and social status. When that spending disappears, the industries built around it collapse. Another critical factor is psychology. Men tend to simplify when alone. Expenses drop, risk tolerance shifts, savings increase. Many men report higher satisfaction once they step away from constant evaluation and negotiation. This does not mean they are happier in every sense, but it does mean they experience fewer points of friction. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Over time, that peace becomes valuable enough to protect. None of this implies hostility or malice toward women. It implies disengagement, and disengagement is harder to reverse than conflict because it offers no leverage when men are no longer seeking approval or validation. Appeals lose power. When they stop participating in shared rituals, those rituals lose meaning. Internationally, some men seek environments where expectations are clearer and interactions feel less adversarial. Lower cost of living, different cultural norms, and economic arbitrage make relocation attractive. This further drains engagement from already strained systems. Meanwhile, automation continues to replace roles that once provided stability. Men adapt by consolidating skills and networks. Women, more often encouraged toward consumption and credentialing, face a system that no longer guarantees support. What we are watching is not a war or a conspiracy, it is a realignment. Systems built on assumptions about cooperation, attraction, and mutual dependency are failing because those assumptions no longer hold. Men are not organizing against women, they are organizing around themselves. The consequences of that choice are still unfolding, and most people are not prepared for where it leads. To understand how parallel economies form, you first have to understand what causes people to stop trusting shared systems. Trust is not built through slogans or policies, it is built through predictable outcomes. When effort reliably produces reward and risk is proportionate to benefit, people participate willingly. When outcomes become uncertain, penalties become asymmetric, and effort no longer guarantees stability, people adapt by minimizing exposure. This is exactly what has happened across many social and economic systems that once relied on informal cooperation between men and women. Men did not wake up one day and decide to exclude women. They woke up day after day and noticed that the cost of participation kept rising while the benefits kept shrinking until disengagement became the rational choice. Parallel economies do not begin as exclusionary by design, they begin as efficiency driven. A group of people realize they can meet their needs more effectively by dealing only with those who share similar risk tolerance, communication styles, and expectations. Over time, these networks harden, language changes, norms solidify, entry becomes more difficult, not because of hostility, but because trust is harder to establish with outsiders who do not share the same incentives. This is how trade guilds formed historically. This is how professional networks form today. What is different now is that gender itself has become a risk variable, not because of biology, but because of social enforcement mechanisms layered on top of interaction. When men create skill based networks around things like technology, finance, repair work, logistics, or preparedness, those networks prioritize reliability and low drama. Transactions are direct, expectations are explicit, emotional negotiation is minimized. These environments are not hostile, but they are unforgiving. If you cannot deliver value, you are excluded. If you introduce instability, you are removed. Over time, these spaces self select for individuals who prefer structure over validation. That selection process does not ask who deserves access, it simply rewards what works. This is why many women find themselves increasingly disconnected from emerging work and exchange systems. It is not because they are incapable, it is because the systems do not bend to accommodate relational negotiation styles that once dominated mixed environments. When everything becomes measured, tracked, and optimized, personal appeal loses leverage. Competence becomes the only currency. That shift is uncomfortable for anyone raised to believe that social systems exist to absorb individual shortcomings. At the same time, many women were encouraged for decades to trust institutional protection rather than interpersonal negotiation. The message was clear: if something feels unfair, escalate. If something feels uncomfortable, formalize. If something feels risky, demand safeguards. That approach makes sense in environments where institutions are solvent, enforcement is balanced, and resources are abundant. But when systems strain under debt, automation, and declining participation, protection becomes symbolic rather than effective. Institutions can promise safety, but they cannot manufacture cooperation where incentives no longer exist. This is where the gap widens dramatically. Men who step away from institutional dependence often become more resilient in times of instability. They reduce expenses, increase skill depth, and diversify income sources. Women who were encouraged to specialize narrowly or consume aspirational lifestyles find themselves exposed when those systems falter. This is not a moral failure, it is a structural mismatch between expectations and reality. You can see this play out in everyday examples. Services that once relied on goodwill now operate on strict pricing. Informal help is replaced by formal invoices. Time is monetized. When a man provides assistance today, he does so with clear boundaries and compensation, or not at all. This is not cruelty, it is risk management. When goodwill is punished or exploited, it disappears. Markets replace relationships. Culturally, this shift produces confusion because the language has not caught up with the behavior. We still talk about equality, inclusion, and shared progress while acting in ways that fragment society into insulated groups. Men retreat into spaces where they can exist without constant scrutiny. Women are told they are empowered while discovering that empowerment does not guarantee support. The result is resentment on both sides, fueled by mismatched expectations rather than deliberate harm. One of the most overlooked aspects of this shift is how it affects younger generations. Young men are observing the outcomes of older cohorts and adjusting accordingly. They are delaying or avoiding traditional milestones not out of rebellion, but out of caution. They see the risks clearly and choose alternatives that offer stability. Young women, meanwhile, are often told that time is abundant and systems will adapt. When reality contradicts that promise, frustration grows. Technology amplifies these patterns by offering substitutes for interaction. Entertainment replaces companionship. Automation replaces labor. Digital transactions replace trust. For men who already value independence, these tools are liberating. For women who value connection and validation, they can feel isolating. But technology does not negotiate feelings, it rewards usage. As artificial intelligence continues to reshape industries, the divide deepens. Jobs that rely on repetition or surface level communication disappear first. Jobs that require technical depth, system thinking, and adaptability remain. Men, already overrepresented in technical and trade oriented roles, pivot faster. Women, overrepresented in administrative and relational roles, face displacement without clear pathways forward. This is not destiny, but it is the current trajectory. What makes this moment especially volatile is the refusal to acknowledge trade offs. Societies cannot simultaneously maximize safety, minimize friction, and maintain high trust in formal cooperation. Something has to give. Over the past several decades, we prioritized safety and compliance. The cost was spontaneity and goodwill. Men responded by withdrawing energy rather than fighting rules they could not change. That withdrawal starves systems of participation. When participation drops, funding drops. When funding drops, services degrade. When services degrade, trust erodes further. This feedback loop accelerates disengagement. It is not a conspiracy, it is arithmetic. The most uncomfortable truth is that many systems relied on male overcontribution. Men worked longer hours, paid a disproportionate share of taxes, and subsidized social spaces through spending tied to courtship and status. As men reduce participation, the gap becomes visible. Governments respond by raising pressure on those who remain engaged, which pushes even more people away. This is how systems collapse quietly. Women who expected the state to replace male provision now face a reality where the state itself is constrained. Debt limits flexibility, demographics reduce the tax base, automation reduces employment, promises made in abundance become unsustainable in scarcity. When resources tighten, accountability increases. This appeals to fairness lose power. At the interpersonal level, this produces a strange inversion. Women are told they are independent while experiencing greater dependence on systems that are weakening. Men are told they are privileged while opting out of systems that no longer serve them. Both feel misunderstood, both feel blamed, neither feels heard. The concept of men walking away is not a slogan, it is a description of behavior. Men are walking away from dating, from mentorship, from public spaces, from social risk. They are not walking toward isolation alone. They are walking towards smaller, tighter networks where expectations are clear and reciprocity is enforced. These networks do not advertise, they do not recruit, they simply exist. Once established, these spaces are difficult to penetrate. Trust is built slowly. Reputation matters. Complaints carry weight only when backed by evidence. Emotional leverage is minimal. This is alien to anyone accustomed to systems that prioritize feelings over function, but it is deeply attractive to those burned by ambiguity. The irony is that many of the values now criticized as exclusionary are the same values that built stable societies in the past: reliability, accountability, skill, restraint. These are not masculine traits by nature, they are survival traits. In an era of abundance, they seemed optional. In an era of constraint, they become essential. As men retreat into these frameworks, women are faced with a choice that is rarely stated clearly: adapt to systems that reward competence and accountability, or continue relying on institutions that may not be able to deliver. Neither path is easy. Both require humility. What is no longer viable is denial. The future will not be shaped by who is right, but by who adapts. Parallel economies will continue to grow because they work for those inside them. Social spaces that depend on nostalgia or moral pressure will continue to shrink. Cooperation will not disappear, but it will become conditional. Trust will not be given freely, it will be earned. When people ask why appeals for reconciliation are failing, the answer is uncomfortable because it exposes a misunderstanding of how human behavior actually changes. Appeals work when people believe that returning will improve their outcomes. They fail when people have already built alternatives that feel safer, calmer, and more predictable. Men who have walked away are not waiting for an apology, a policy adjustment, or a new narrative. They have reorganized their lives around reduced dependency. Once that reorganization happens, persuasion loses its force. You cannot persuade someone to re enter a system they no longer need. This is why messaging campaigns fall flat. When institutions tell men that society needs them, men hear a request without incentive. When men are told they are essential but also interchangeable, they hear contradiction. When men are told to engage more while also being warned about risk at every step, they hear danger. Behavior follows perception, not intention. The intention behind reconciliation messages may be sincere, but the perception is that the cost remains too high. There is also a generational divide forming that rarely gets discussed honestly. Older generations remember a time when cooperation between men and women was assumed, informal, and reinforced by shared expectations. Younger men do not have that memory. Their formative experiences are shaped by digital mediation, institutional oversight, and public consequences. They did not watch trust erode gradually. They inherited a landscape where caution is the default. For them, withdrawal is not rebellion, it is normalcy. Young women, meanwhile, are often told that opportunity will expand endlessly if they focus on themselves. They are encouraged to delay decisions under the assumption that systems will adapt around them. What they are not told is that systems adapt based on participation, not aspiration. When participation drops, systems contract. By the time that contraction becomes visible, the window for easy adjustment has already closed. One of the most destabilizing outcomes of this divide is the collapse of shared cultural narratives. Stories matter because they guide expectations. For generations, the story was simple. Education led to work. Work led to partnership. Partnership led to stability. That story no longer aligns with a reality for a growing number of people. When stories break, people improvise. Improvisation favors those with fewer dependencies. This is why men who simplify their lives often appear to be doing better in uncertain times. Fewer obligations mean fewer points of failure. Fewer expectations mean fewer disappointments. This does not mean men are immune to hardship. It means they are structured to absorb shocks with less emotional and financial damage. Systems built on mutual reliance struggle when one side withdraws effort. Demographics amplify these pressures. Declining birth rates are not just about reproduction, they are about future labor, future taxes, and future care. When fewer children are born, the cost of maintaining systems rises for those who remain. This creates a feedback loop where younger participants feel burdened by promises they did not make. Men respond by minimizing exposure. Women respond by seeking security from institutions that are already strained. Power dynamics shift quietly in this environment. Influence flows toward those who control scarce resources or operate outside centralized systems. Decentralized finance, remote work, peer to peer exchange, and skill based communities gain leverage because they are harder to regulate and tax. Participation is voluntary, exit is easy. These characteristics attract individuals who value autonomy over recognition. Women who attempt to enter these spaces often encounter resistance, not because of hostility, but because trust is slow and standards are rigid. Entry requires proof of value, not alignment with ideals. This feels exclusionary to those accustomed to systems that promise inclusion first and accountability later. But from the perspective of those inside, standards are survival mechanisms. As these parallel structures mature, they begin to influence mainstream systems indirectly. When enough people opt out of traditional paths, those paths lose legitimacy. Education becomes questioned when it no longer guarantees employment. Social rituals lose appeal when they no longer produce connection. Authority weakens when compliance is optional. This is not collapse in the dramatic sense, it is erosion. The erosion creates anxiety because it removes familiar reference points. People want to believe there is a lever someone can pull to restore balance. They look for policy fixes, cultural resets, or technological solutions. But the underlying issue is behavioral. People have learned new patterns that work for them individually, even if they strain the collective. Reversing that requires offering better outcomes, not better arguments. One of the most difficult conversations to have is about accountability without blame. Many women feel blindsided by these changes because they were told empowerment meant independence without cost. Many men feel dismissed because their withdrawal is framed as resentment rather than adaptation. Both perspectives miss the larger point. Systems shape behavior more than ideology does. When systems reward disengagement spreads. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation fail. Shame only works when people care about approval from the shaming group. Men who have exited do not. Their reference group has shifted. Validation comes from competence, not compliance. Respect comes from results, not recognition. Once that value system takes hold, external criticism loses relevance. The same dynamic applies in reverse. Women who seek reassurance from institutions often receive symbolic support but little material security. Promises are made in language rather than resources. When reality intrudes, frustration grows. That frustration is often misdirected at men who are no longer participating rather than at systems that overpromised and underdelivered. Over time, this misalignment creates cultural fragmentation. People talk past each other because they are operating from different assumptions. One side believes cooperation is a moral obligation. The other believes cooperation is a negotiated exchange. One side appeals to fairness, the other appeals to function. Without a shared framework, dialogue becomes performative. What makes this moment particularly fragile is that many of the buffers that once absorbed tension are gone. Extended families are smaller, communities are less cohesive, institutions are less trusted, media amplifies conflict rather than resolution. In that environment, individuals default to self protection. Men do so by withdrawing, women do so by seeking guarantees. Both strategies reduce organic cooperation. The long term consequence is a society where interaction becomes transactional by necessity. When goodwill is scarce, contracts proliferate. When trust is low, surveillance increases. When participation is optional, incentives must rise. These conditions are expensive. They favor those with leverage and adaptability. They disadvantage those who rely on stability. This is where the concept of walking away becomes central. Walking away is not about abandoning responsibility, it is about redefining it. Men who walk away are still responsible for themselves. They still work, plan, and contribute. They simply no longer volunteer surplus energy to systems that do not reciprocate. That surplus used to sustain many social structures. Without it, those structures shrink. The question is not whether this is fair, the question is whether it is reversible. And the honest answer is that reversibility depends on willingness to redesign systems around realistic incentives. That means acknowledging trade offs openly. It means accepting that safety has costs, that autonomy has limits, and that cooperation cannot be mandated without consequence. For women navigating this landscape, the path forward is not hopeless, but it is different from what many were promised. Adaptation requires developing skills that translate across systems, building resilience without guaranteed backup, and engaging with men as partners rather than providers or adversaries. That requires humility on both sides. For men, the challenge is avoiding isolation that hardens into disengagement from humanity itself. Walking away from dysfunctional systems does not require walking away from meaning. The risk is mistaking peace for purpose. Sustainable autonomy still benefits from connection, even if that connection looks different than before. The next phase of this transition will be defined by whether new forms of cooperation emerge that balance accountability with trust. That will not come from nostalgia or blame. It will come from experimentation, small communities, clear rules, shared risk. These environments already exist at the margins. Their success or failure will shape what replaces the old model. As we move forward, it becomes increasingly clear that the future will not resemble the past, no matter how loudly people demand it. The assumptions that once held society together no longer apply universally. Pretending otherwise delays adaptation. The sooner this is acknowledged, the less painful the transition becomes. Transformation rarely announces itself clearly. It unfolds through a series of quiet adjustments that only look obvious in hindsight. When historians eventually examine this period, they will not point to one speech, one law, or one viral moment as the turning point. They will point to behavior. They will point to participation rates, spending patterns, migration trends, and the slow hollowing out of spaces that once depended on assumed cooperation. What we are living through now is not the collapse of society, but the end of a particular arrangement that many people believed was permanent simply because it lasted long enough to feel normal. One of the most misunderstood elements of this shift is the idea that men walking away is driven by anger. Anger burns hot and fast. It seeks confrontation. What we are seeing instead is something colder and more durable. It is indifference. Indifference does not argue, it does not protest, it reallocates time and attention elsewhere. That is why it is so destabilizing. Systems can respond to anger, they struggle to respond to silence. Indifference grows when repeated effort produces diminishing returns. For many men, participation in traditional social structures stopped making sense long before they consciously articulated why. Dating became expensive, risky, and emotionally draining. Work became less rewarding relative to effort. Public spaces became monitored rather than welcoming. Informal generosity became a liability rather than a virtue. None of these changes happened overnight. They accumulated until opting out felt like relief. What is rarely acknowledged is how quickly humans adapt once they experience relief. When stressors are removed, even if the resulting life is simpler, the nervous system recalibrates. Peace becomes the new baseline. Reintroducing chaos then feels intolerable. This is why so many men who step away do not return, even when circumstances improve slightly. The memory of peace outweighs the promise of reward. Women observing this shift often interpret it as abandonment rather than adaptation. From their perspective, men are withholding effort that once flowed freely. What is missed is that effort was flowing under a different set of expectations. When those expectations changed unilaterally, behavior followed. Men did not stop caring, they stopped volunteering surplus. This surplus was invisible when it existed. It was the extra hour at work, the extra dollar spent, the extra emotional labor performed without recognition. Surplus feels endless until it is withdrawn. Once withdrawn, its absence reveals how dependent systems were on it. That realization is uncomfortable because it forces a reevaluation of narratives built around equality without symmetry. Symmetry does not mean sameness, it means balanced exchange. When exchange becomes lopsided, resentment grows. Men responded to that imbalance not by demanding correction, but by exiting the transaction. Exit is the ultimate form of feedback in any system. It does not argue with rules, it renders them irrelevant. This is why attempts to regulate behavior through increased pressure often backfire. When exit is easy, pressure accelerates withdrawal. Digital tools make exit easier than ever. Remote work reduces geographic dependency. Online communities replace local ones. Digital finance bypasses traditional gatekeepers. Men who once felt trapped now feel mobile. Mobility reduces tolerance for friction. As mobility increases, loyalty decreases. This is not cynicism, it is efficiency. Loyalty made sense when options were limited and coordination required trust. In a world of abundant options and low switching costs, loyalty must be earned continuously. Many institutions failed to adapt to this reality. They relied on moral obligation rather than competitive value. Women were often told that loyalty was a given, that society would bend to accommodate changing preferences. What was not emphasized is that bending has limits. When systems bend too far, they snap. Men walking away is one expression of that snap. It is not dramatic, it is structural. Another layer to this transformation is how masculinity itself is being redefined by absence rather than assertion. Traditional masculinity was once tied to public roles: provider, protector, participant. As those roles lost clarity or became contested, men did not replace them with new public identities. They replaced them with private standards: discipline, self sufficiency, minimalism, control over environment. And this inward turn is misinterpreted as selfishness. In reality, it is boundary setting. Boundaries are what people erect when trust is low. They are not walls meant to isolate forever, they are defenses meant to preserve energy. When boundaries are respected, they can soften. When they are attacked, they harden. Women navigating this environment face a difficult adjustment because many were encouraged to externalize security. Education would provide stability, institutions would provide protection, visibility would provide leverage. These strategies worked in a growing system. They falter in a contracting one. When resources tighten, visibility becomes competition, protection becomes rationed, credentials become oversupplied. This mismatch creates a sense of betrayal. Women did what they were told and still feel exposed. That feeling is real. But directing that frustration at men who opted out does not solve the underlying problem. Men did not remove guarantees, they simply stopped subsidizing them. At the societal level, this shift creates a paradox. We have more communication than ever, yet less understanding. Everyone can speak. Few feel heard. Algorithms amplify outrage because outrage keeps attention. Nuance disappears. Complex trade offs are flattened into moral slogans. In that environment, quiet adaptation goes unnoticed until its effects are irreversible. Consider how many public spaces now feel empty or strained. Restaurants close, gyms struggle, social clubs disappear. These are not just economic losses, they are relational losses. They were places where informal bonds formed. When men stopped attending, those spaces lost critical mass. They did not adapt because their model assumed male participation was constant. The same dynamic plays out in workplaces. Mentorship programs exist on paper, but informal mentorship declines. People avoid risk, they document everything. Collaboration becomes cautious, innovation slows, efficiency replaces creativity. These environments are stable but sterile. Men who thrive on autonomy leave, those who remain comply. Over time, compliance cultures become brittle. They function until stress increases. Then they fracture because no one feels ownership. Men walking away is not the cause of fragility, it is a response to it. But responses can become reinforcing loops. The more men withdraw, the more fragile systems become. The more fragile systems become, the more men withdraw. Breaking that loop would require restoring mutual benefit, not through nostalgia, but through redesign. That redesign would require acknowledging that participation must be worth the risk. It would require reducing penalties for engagement. It would require accepting that not every discomfort is harm. These are difficult conversations, and they are rarely rewarded politically. So instead, we get denial. We get messaging that insists nothing fundamental has changed. We get blame directed at those who opt out. We get calls for participation without reform. This only accelerates disengagement. You cannot shame people into trusting a system that has already shown them its limits. Another aspect often overlooked is how this shift affects identity formation. Identity used to be tied to roles recognized by society: husband, father, worker, citizen. As those roles weaken or become optional, identity becomes self constructed. Self construction requires internal standards. Men walking away often develop rigid personal codes because external validation is unreliable. These codes are not ideological, they are practical. Do not take unnecessary risk. Do not spend where returns are uncertain. Do not engage where rules are unclear. Do not rely on promises without collateral. These principles guide behavior quietly but powerfully. They are not debated online, they are lived. Women encountering men who operate by these principles sometimes interpret them as cold or transactional. From the male perspective, they are protective. They are the result of learning through loss. Once learned, they are difficult to unlearn. This brings us to an uncomfortable realization. Many of the things people want men to return to are the very things men associate with instability: casual generosity, unstructured interaction, emotional availability without safeguards. These behaviors are framed as virtues, but for those who experience negative outcomes, they feel reckless. Reconciliation, if it were to happen, would require reframing participation as mutually beneficial rather than morally required. It would require creating environments where trust is rewarded, not penalized. That is possible, but it is not simple. It cannot be achieved through slogans. It requires redesigning incentives at every level. Until that happens, parallel paths will continue to diverge. Men will continue to build small, resilient networks. Women will continue to navigate larger, more volatile systems. Some individuals will cross successfully, many will not. The gap will feel personal, but its roots are structural. The next decade will be defined by how people respond to this reality. Those who prepare will find opportunity. Those who wait for restoration will find disappointment. Preparation does not mean hostility, it means clarity. Knowing where you stand, knowing what you offer, knowing what you will not tolerate. Agency is the word that quietly replaces hope when systems stop delivering what they promise. When people realize that waiting no longer produces results, they stop waiting. They begin shaping their lives around what they can directly control. This is the psychological pivot we are witnessing now, and it explains why so many conversations about unity, healing, or returning to previous norms feel hollow. Those messages assume people are still dependent on the old structure. Many are not. For men who have already adapted, the idea of going back feels irrational. They have rebuilt routines that minimize friction. Their lives are quieter, more contained, and more predictable. They are not chasing status through public validation. They are not seeking permission to exist. They are not negotiating their worth through social approval. This internalization of value is a profound shift, and it fundamentally alters how men relate to the world. What often goes unspoken is that this internalization is not effortless. It is forged through loss, disappointment, and recalibration. Men did not arrive here because it was easy. They arrived here because every alternative proved more costly. Once that lesson is learned, it becomes the lens through which all future decisions are filtered. Trust is no longer assumed, it is earned slowly. Cooperation is no longer automatic, it is conditional. Women, on the other hand, are often navigating a conflicting set of signals. They are told they are empowered, yet they feel increasingly constrained. They are told to prioritize self expression, yet they are penalized when systems tighten. They are told support exists, yet when they reach for it, they find it limited, delayed, or symbolic. This dissonance produces anxiety because it undermines confidence in both personal choice and institutional stability. The result is a growing gap in lived experience. Men and women are reacting to the same environment in opposite ways. Men reduce exposure, women increase demands for support. Neither strategy is inherently wrong. They are rational responses to perceived risk. But when these strategies collide, misunderstanding escalates. One of the most damaging myths in circulation is the idea that disengagement is reversible through persuasion alone. It is not. Persuasion works when people feel uncertain. Men who have walked away feel certain. Certainty is a powerful stabilizer. It reduces anxiety, it clarifies priorities. Once certainty replaces hope, it becomes extremely difficult to dislodge. This is why attempts to reframe narratives around masculinity often miss the mark. Telling men they are needed does not motivate those who have already learned to meet their own needs. Telling men they are valued does not resonate with those who learned that value fluctuates based on compliance. What motivates these men is utility. Does participation improve my life or complicate it? That question drives behavior far more than moral appeal. Another misconception is that men walking away are isolated or lonely. Some are, many are not. They are connected differently. Their connections are fewer but deeper. Their circles are smaller but more reliable. They invest energy where reciprocity is clear. This selectivity is misread as withdrawal when it is actually refinement. Women often interpret this refinement as exclusion. From their perspective, doors that were once open now feel closed. What changed is not the door itself, but the cost of entry. When standards rise, access narrows. That is uncomfortable, especially in cultures that equated inclusion with fairness. But fairness without sustainability collapses. As this shift continues, we see the emergence of what could be called quiet stratification, not based on class alone, but on adaptability. Those who learn quickly and restructure thrive. Those who wait for reassurance struggle. This stratification cuts across gender, but its expression differs. Men adapt through withdrawal and consolidation. Women adapt through negotiation and appeal. The environment rewards the former more consistently in times of instability. This is not because the environment favors men inherently. It favors behaviors aligned with autonomy, flexibility, and low dependency. Historically, men were socialized toward these traits. Women were socialized toward interdependence. When interdependence is no longer reliably supported, those socialization patterns become liabilities rather than strengths. This creates a painful reckoning. Skills that once ensured success no longer guarantee survival. Traits once praised become questioned. People feel cheated not because they failed, but because the rules changed without warning. That sense of betrayal fuels resentment, and resentment seeks targets. Men who walked away become convenient targets because their absence is visible. They are accused of selfishness, immaturity, or fear. What is rarely acknowledged is that their absence is feedback. It signals that the system no longer meets their threshold for participation. Ignoring that feedback does not make it disappear, it amplifies it. One of the hardest truths to accept is that societies do not function on fairness alone, they function on incentives. When incentives misalign, outcomes diverge regardless of intent. The intent behind empowerment movements may have been equity and protection. The incentive structure that emerged discouraged engagement and risk taking. Men responded accordingly. This does not mean women are to blame. Blame is a distraction. The issue is alignment. Systems encourage behaviors without accounting for trade offs. Now, those trade offs are coming due. The bill is not paid by ideology, it is paid by participation. As participation drops, scarcity increases. Scarcity sharpens priorities. Under scarcity, people retreat to what they can control. That is why we see men focusing on self improvement, skill acquisition, and asset accumulation. These are forms of insurance in an uncertain world. Women facing scarcity often seek collective solutions. These approaches clash when resources are limited. The future will not reward denial, it will reward clarity. Individuals who acknowledge constraints early can adapt gracefully. Those who cling to outdated assurances will experience shock when reality intrudes. This applies to both men and women. Constructive paths forward exist, but they require abandoning illusions. Cooperation must be voluntary and mutually beneficial. Protection must be balanced with accountability. Safety must be weighed against vitality. These are uncomfortable trade offs, but they are unavoidable. At the individual level, adaptation means cultivating skills that travel, skills that are valuable regardless of location or institution. It means reducing reliance on single points of failure. It means building networks based on trust rather than proximity. Men are already doing this at scale. Women who succeed in this environment often adopt similar strategies, even if they frame them differently. At the relational level, it means redefining partnership away from entitlement and toward collaboration. Relationships cannot be sustained on expectation alone. They require shared risk and shared reward. Men who walked away did so because they perceived imbalance. Restoring balance requires more than reassurance, it requires structural change. At the cultural level, it means letting go of narratives that no longer reflect reality. The idea that society will always absorb individual risk is no longer tenable. The idea that participation is owed rather than earned is collapsing. New stories must emerge, grounded in reciprocity rather than obligation. None of this guarantees harmony. Transitions are messy. Some people will feel left behind. Some will feel vindicated. What matters is whether we learn from behavior rather than suppress it. Men walking away is not a tantrum, it is data. Ignoring data leads to miscalculation. Miscalculation leads to policy failure. Policy failure accelerates disengagement. This cycle is already visible. Breaking it requires humility from institutions and individuals alike. As we approach the end of this discussion, the picture becomes clearer. We are not witnessing the end of relationships, cooperation, or society. We are witnessing the end of assumed participation. Everything going forward will be negotiated explicitly or not at all. For some, this is frightening. For others, it is liberating. For most, it is confusing, but confusion is temporary. Adaptation is permanent. Personal responsibility is the concept that survives every societal shift because it does not depend on permission, funding, or consensus. When structures weaken, responsibility does not disappear. It transfers. In times of stability, responsibility can be shared broadly and invisibly. In times of transition, it becomes personal and unmistakable. That is where we are now. The systems that once absorbed risk are no longer capable of doing so at scale, and individuals are being forced to confront the reality that no one is coming to save them in the way they were promised. For men who walked away early, this realization arrived gradually. They felt it in the changing tone of interactions, in the shrinking margin for error, in the growing sense that effort no longer translated into appreciation or security. They adjusted before they had language for it. They reduced expectations. They simplified needs. They withdrew from arenas where outcomes were unpredictable. What looked like retreat from the outside was, from the inside, consolidation. For women encountering this reality later, the adjustment is sharper. Many did exactly what they were told would lead to fulfillment and stability, only to discover that the guarantees attached to those paths were conditional and temporary. That discovery feels personal, even though it is structural. It produces anger, fear, and disbelief because it challenges the belief that society progresses in a straight line toward greater security. It does not. It oscillates based on incentives, resources, and behavior. The danger at this stage is bitterness. Bitterness hardens perspective and closes off learning. Men can become bitter if withdrawal turns into resentment rather than clarity. Women can become bitter if disappointment turns into blame rather than adaptation. Bitterness feels justified, but it is corrosive. It traps people in narratives that no longer produce results. Walking away at its healthiest is not about rejection, it is about discernment. It is choosing where to invest finite energy. It is refusing to participate in arrangements that consistently produce loss. That principle applies universally, not just to gender dynamics. People walk away from jobs, from cities, from institutions, from habits. When enough people walk away from the same thing, it signals systemic failure. What makes this moment uniquely challenging is that many people are trying to force continuation rather than designing replacement. They want the old system to work again without acknowledging why it stopped working. They want participation without renegotiation. That approach cannot succeed. Participation that is coerced is unstable. Participation that is incentivized properly is resilient. This is why the future belongs to small, adaptive structures rather than large, rigid ones. Communities built on clear expectations, relationships built on shared responsibility, work built on measurable contribution. These structures are not perfect, but they are flexible. They can absorb shocks because they do not rely on illusion. For individuals watching this unfold, the most important question is not who is right, but what works. What choices reduce stress rather than amplify it? What environments reward effort rather than punish it? What relationships feel reciprocal rather than draining? These questions cut through ideology and point directly to behavior. Men who remain grounded through this transition do so by anchoring themselves in purpose rather than validation. Purpose does not require applause, it requires alignment between values and action. Men who walk away without purpose risk drifting into isolation. Men who walk away with purpose build something quieter but stronger. The difference is intention. Women who navigate this transition successfully do so by cultivating agency rather than expectation. Agency means building skills that convert to value across contexts. It means reducing dependency on single systems. It means choosing partnerships where contribution flows both ways. These women exist and they thrive, not because they were favored, but because they adapted early. The narrative that pits men and women against each other obscures this truth. The real divide is between those who adapt and those who wait. Waiting feels safe until it is not. Preparation feels unnecessary until it becomes essential. There is no reset button coming. No cultural apology that restores the old arrangement. No policy tweak that reactivates assumed cooperation. What will emerge instead is something leaner and more explicit. Fewer assumptions, clearer boundaries, higher standards, lower tolerance for ambiguity. That future will feel colder to those who relied on warmth without structure. It will feel calmer to those who sought structure without warmth. Neither experience is complete on its own. The challenge ahead is integrating both without repeating the mistakes that led here. The path forward is not mass reconciliation, it is selective alignment. People finding others who share similar risk tolerance, work ethic, and expectations. That applies to friendships, relationships, and work. Large scale cohesion may diminish, but local coherence can strengthen. If there is one lesson to take from this entire discussion, it is that behavior tells the truth before language catches up. Men walking away is not a talking point. It is an observable pattern. Ignoring it delays adaptation. Demonizing it accelerates fragmentation. Understanding it creates options. This does not mean endorsing every outcome or celebrating every consequence. It means recognizing reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. Mature societies confront reality early. Declining societies argue with it until collapse forces compliance. You, as an individual, still have choices. You can build resilience. You can choose clarity over comfort. You can engage selectively rather than reactively. You can decide where your energy goes instead of allowing it to be extracted by systems that do not return value. And this is where the conversation comes back to you. What did you think about what was discussed today? Do you agree with the patterns described? Have you observed similar changes in your own life, your workplace, or your relationships? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because these conversations matter more when they happen openly rather than in silence. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.